Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a part of medieval history. You probably haven't heard about the secretive and scandalous lives of medieval nuns. Imagine a time where silence, piety, and devotion were expected of those living behind convent walls. But here's the twist: those same walls, with all their prayers and rituals, often hid a lot more than just holy acts. For centuries, these women were expected to be the epitome of virtue, and yet many of them were involved in the kinds of activities that would make even the most seasoned scandalmongers blush. Picture this: you're walking through the cold stone halls of an abbey, hearing the faint rustling of robes, the whispered prayers in the corridors, and the scent of incense hanging in the air. But beneath that serene surface, there's a different story being told, one of forbidden love, power struggles, and secret alliances. You probably wouldn't last a day in this world, especially with its web of hidden desires and the sheer number of rules being bent and broken. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and feel free to post your location and local time in the comments below. I'm always curious where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As we step back in time, let's take a closer look at the role of nuns in the medieval world. The life of a nun was supposed to be one of devotion, prayer, and absolute obedience. You were taught to follow a rigid code of behavior, swearing off material pleasures, romance, and anything that could be considered a distraction from a life of service to God. But let's be real here. Humans don't exactly have the best track record of sticking to the rules, do they? And this was no exception. You might be surprised to learn that in many convents, women weren't just taking vows of chastity and poverty. They were also taking on secretive roles of power. In fact, many abbesses, essentially the female equivalent of abbots, were among the most powerful women in medieval Europe. These abbesses didn't just oversee prayers and the upkeep of the abbey. They controlled vast land holdings, had significant political influence, and sometimes even wielded more power than the kings of the time. Historians still argue whether these women were as saintly as they were portrayed, or if they used their positions to manipulate events in their favor, quietly pulling strings behind the scenes. Take Hildegard of Bingen, for example. She was a famous abbess in the 12th century who not only influenced religious thought, but also dabbled in medicine, music, and even politics. Hildegard wrote books, gave advice to kings, and gained a reputation for her prophetic visions. Yet despite her position in the church, there were rumors of a forbidden relationship with some of the men in her life. Though this is still a subject of much debate. Did she simply want to control her own destiny? Or was there something more scandalous going on? And Abbess Heloise, known for her famous love affair with the philosopher Peter Abelard, wasn't the only one who had a hidden romantic side. Many nuns, behind their veils, formed deep emotional connections with men or fellow nuns, breaking their vows while still managing to maintain their pious facades. Historians still wonder how much of this was about love, lust, or a desire for power in a system that often relegated women to secondary roles. And let's not even get started on the secretive lives of nuns and their relationship with wealth. Many convents were extremely wealthy, and a great deal of that wealth came from the nuns' land ownership. But not every nun was content to live in humble circumstances. Some, like Blanche of Castile, the mother of King Louis IX of France, used their convents as a means of political maneuvering. Convents were, after all, independent entities, often with ties to both the church and secular rulers. Some abbesses even had their own personal armies to defend their lands. Imagine that, women in charge of fortresses, wielding political power and authority, running their estates like warlords only without the battle axes. And then, of course, there's the ever-popular story of the forbidden love affair, the most famous or infamous being the tale of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was married to two different kings, and whose passionate affairs with influential men were well documented in court records. But she wasn't the only one who used love as a tool. Nuns, too, sometimes found themselves involved in romantic liaisons that defied their vows, an act often covered up by the church authorities, who had no desire to let the truth spill out. These scandals, despite their forbidden nature, were common enough that they became a source of gossip and whispers in medieval society. As we step deeper into the lives of medieval nuns, let's focus on the political influence they held, which was often much greater than what we'd expect from women who were supposed to be living lives of piety. While most nuns were expected to remain in the shadows of church life, some found ways to carve out considerable power for themselves, especially when it came to land management and political manipulation. Imagine being a female ruler with entire estates, huge political influence, and the ability to shape policies from behind convent walls. Pretty wild, right? Yet this was the reality for several abbesses, who often had to navigate both the religious and political landscapes of their time with subtlety and cunning. One of the most famous examples of this is Hildegard of Bingen, a remarkable abbess who wielded incredible influence not just within the church, but also across Europe. Hildegard wasn't your average cloistered nun. She was a visionary, a writer, and an advisor to kings. Historians still argue whether she was simply a devout religious figure, or if she was actually using her spiritual status to manipulate powerful men to gain leverage. With her books on medicine, theology, and natural science, she became not just a religious icon, but also a figure with real influence in shaping medieval thought and politics. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for abbesses like Hildegard to have a say in political decisions that affected their territories. They were often responsible for administering vast amounts of land, which were sometimes worth more than those owned by kings and lords. Many abbesses had their own private armies and guarded fortresses to protect their estates, and some even had the power to levy taxes. The church was extremely protective of its lands, and these powerful women knew how to use that protection to their advantage. Historians still debate whether these abbesses were simply exercising religious authority or if they were acting as political power brokers. Yet, there were also the more subtle forms of manipulation. Take the case of Abbess Clare of Assisi, for instance. While she's often seen as a saintly figure, Clare was also deeply involved in the political machinations within the Franciscan order. She wasn't just a figurehead. Clare's influence allowed her to dictate terms to the church and even challenge papal authority at times. It's easy to forget, but women like Clare, despite living in the restrictive environment of the church, were able to play significant roles in shaping the church's structure and policy. Of course, not all nuns had the same degree of influence, but many still managed to find ways to bend the rules to suit their needs. Some nuns engaged in what we might call elite networking, using their positions within the abbey to form powerful connections with the nobility or even with royalty. The most powerful abbesses were often closely allied with royal families, and some of them played roles in the arranged marriages of their noble relatives. These abbesses were not just spiritual leaders, but also key political players, and their influence often extended far beyond their convent walls. This political clout often extended into the area of land ownership. The church, as you might expect, was a massive landowner during the medieval period, and nuns, especially those in charge of large abbeys, had a hand in managing and distributing that wealth. But this wealth also attracted scandal, especially when it came to the way some nuns managed their assets. It wasn't unusual for abbesses to form secret alliances with wealthy merchants, or to barter with nobles for favors in exchange for land or property. Historians are still divided on how much of this was corruption, or just the practicalities of running an abbey in such a cutthroat environment. Was it just about the survival of the institution, or were some nuns getting in too deep? And let's not forget the questionable spending. In some cases, these women didn't exactly live by the same rules of austerity they were supposed to preach. Some nuns had access to luxurious fabrics, jewels, and fine foods, which might sound a bit out of place in an abbey where vows of poverty were supposed to reign. This lifestyle, especially when it was the abbesses who were indulging in such luxuries, didn't go unnoticed by those in power, and rumors about such excesses swirled in the halls of the church. How much of this was necessary for the running of the abbey, and how much was pure indulgence? Historians still argue whether these women were just guilty of safeguarding the abbey's resources or living a secret life of opulence. Despite the rules, the temptation of power and wealth was ever present, and the personal lives of these women often became intertwined with political, financial, and social networks that were anything but spiritual. It seems these women were never quite able to completely separate their duties from the worldly desires that lurked beneath the surface. Some were even involved in illicit relationships, which, of course, would later become the subject of whispered gossip and scandal. And so, we find ourselves in a world of complexity. Nuns who were both devoted and cunning, pious and power-hungry, holy and disobedient. As we continue our exploration of the scandalous lives of medieval nuns, let's dive into the forbidden love affairs that often unfolded in the hidden corners of convents. Now, you might be thinking, wait a second, didn't nuns take vows of chastity? And yes, technically, they did. But, as with most rules throughout history, there were those who found ways to bend, break, or outright ignore them. The convents, which were meant to be places of piety and silence, were often full of whispered secrets and surreptitious relationships that would put even the most dramatic soap operas to shame. Take Heloise, for example, the brilliant nun whose famous love affair with the philosopher Peter Abelard is still one of history's most talked about scandals. It wasn't just a brief fling, it was a full-fledged romance that began with intellectual admiration and quickly escalated to a passionate relationship. Now, this wasn't a simple, innocent love story. Their affair, as historians still debate, led to Abelard's castration, which, let's be honest, is pretty dramatic, even by medieval standards. But, even after this tragic event, Heloise and Abelard's love didn't die. In fact, Heloise went on to become a nun, but not just any nun. A nun with a very complex relationship with Abelard that lasted until his death. Some scholars still argue whether Heloise was truly committed to the religious life, or whether she was using her status to maintain a connection to the man she loved. Was her life of piety just a way to preserve her connection to Abelard, or was she genuinely devoted to her religious duties? It's one of those questions that keeps historians up at night. But Heloise wasn't the only one. There were other nuns who had love affairs with powerful men, often in secret, while keeping up the appearance of devotion. For example, some nuns formed emotional bonds with their confessors or local lords. These relationships were sometimes romantic, sometimes more about social maneuvering, but in either case, they were relationships that were supposed to be forbidden. Even today, scholars are divided over how much of this was truly about love versus political ambition. Was it just about women in power finding ways to connect, or were these women simply craving a sense of emotional fulfillment in a society that was otherwise cold and demanding? Then there were the unspoken, clandestine relationships between nuns themselves. The bonds that formed in convents often transcended friendship, sometimes blossoming into love. While such relationships were rarely talked about in public, there are historical records that hint at the affectionate attachments between nuns. In fact, many convents had reputations for harboring romantic relationships that were overlooked by the church until, of course, the inevitable scandal broke. The church, while trying to uphold vows of chastity, often turned a blind eye to these relationships as long as they didn't cause too much public commotion. Historians still argue about how widespread these kinds of relationships were. But there's little doubt that many nuns had connections that went well beyond platonic love. Speaking of connections, let's not forget the power dynamics that came into play within these convents. Some nuns, especially those with noble lineage, were able to maintain high positions within the abbey, giving them access to wealth, power, and influence. These nuns weren't just making secret alliances with men. They were also weaving intricate networks among other noble families. This allowed them to amass power and often use their position for personal gain. In fact, Many abbesses could control vast amounts of land and resources, which often led to accusations of corruption and mismanagement. The abbey, meant to be a sanctuary for the soul, often turned into a center for political bargaining and economic control. But what about those nuns who didn't play the power game? What about those who found themselves caught in romantic entanglements simply because they were vulnerable to the same human desires that anyone else might feel? Imagine being a young woman, locked away in a convent, surrounded by other women, but with limited contact with the outside world. Despite the vows of silence and chastity, emotional bonds formed the intense, often misunderstood kind of affection that could easily blossom into something more. And when that something more came to light, it wasn't always well received by the church, which had its own ways of dealing with what it saw as moral failings. Punishments for these infractions were, of course, severe. The church didn't exactly take kindly to the idea of nuns engaging in relationships that went against their vows. But the interesting thing is that many nuns, rather than showing remorse, would go to great lengths to cover up their affairs or even defend their actions. Some historians argue that these women were simply looking for freedom in a world that offered them very few choices. Others contend that they were just playing the game of power, trying to gain some control over their otherwise restricted lives. As we continue down this rabbit hole of scandal, let's not forget the public perceptions of these nuns. While some were able to keep their secrets hidden, others were not so lucky. There are numerous stories of nuns who were exposed, their love affairs and power plays coming to light, much to the shock and scandal of their communities. These stories, once whispered among the clergy, eventually became legendary tales of the medieval world. Tales of women who defied the rules, broke free from the chains of tradition, and lived lives full of passion and intrigue. Now, let's shift focus to the punishments and consequences that came with the scandalous behaviors of medieval nuns. As you might expect, the church had some pretty intense ways of dealing with the transgressions of those who swore to live pious and celibate lives. For nuns caught in forbidden relationships or power struggles, the consequences were often severe, and sometimes the punishments went beyond the physical. In many cases, punishment was not just about correcting behavior, but also about maintaining the reputation of the abbey and the church's authority. The idea was simple. If nuns were allowed to break their vows, what would stop the entire institution from falling apart? The problem was that many of the punishments could be downright bizarre and, at times, brutal. Take, for example, the public penance that some nuns had to endure when their misdeeds were uncovered. These public shaming ceremonies were meant to remind everyone that no one, not even the most powerful abbess, was above the law. Historians still argue whether these public punishments were meant to be purely symbolic, a way for the church to exert control, or if they were actually effective in deterring further rule-breaking. It's a bit like watching someone get reprimanded in front of the whole class. Uncomfortable, but also oddly satisfying for the onlookers. In some cases, nuns were forced to wear hair shirts or engage in long periods of fasting as a form of repentance. Imagine being made to sit through long, silent hours, wearing a shirt made of rough, itchy fabric, with your every move watched by the rest of the convent. Not exactly an easy life, and certainly not one that encouraged relaxation or comfort. But it wasn't all about public embarrassment. The consequences for nuns involved in more serious scandals, like illicit affairs, could be more severe. Imprisonment was a common punishment, especially for nuns who had been accused of breaking their vows of chastity. In extreme cases, nuns could even be exiled from the abbey and sent to live in isolation as a form of spiritual cleansing. The idea was that by removing them from the community, the church could ensure that they would no longer pose a threat to the sanctity of the abbey. And let's be clear, exile in medieval times was no easy feat. The women who were sent away often faced life in utter isolation, cut off from all the privileges and power they had once held as part of the abbey. Interestingly, some nuns who were punished for their illicit behaviors or rule-breaking found that life outside the convent was not the end of their stories. Some even used their exile as an opportunity to form new alliances or continue their relationships in secret. There's an old saying that goes something like, "You can take the nun out of the convent, but you can't take the convent out of the nun." It was the same with these rebellious women. Sometimes exile only pushed them to find new ways of exerting their power outside the institution's boundaries. Of course, not all punishments were physical. For some nuns, the loss of spiritual status was the ultimate form of punishment. The fear of being ostracized from the church or losing their sacred status within the abbey was a fate worse than death for many medieval women. Imagine the dread of waking up one day only to find that your place in the convent, your purpose in life, and your standing in the church had all been revoked. This was not just a personal loss, it was a social death. The church held such power in medieval society that to be removed from its grace meant a life full of shame and scorn. Some nuns, however, became so entrenched in the power dynamics of the convent that the church's punishment never really had the intended effect. Take Catherine de' Medici, for example, a woman who lived in a time when the nuns' power was often intertwined with the politics of the monarchy. While not a nun herself, Catherine's manipulation of the political system had far-reaching consequences that also affected the female religious world. Many women like Catherine, or even nuns in less famous cases, found ways to work the system, turning even punishment into a tool of empowerment. Catherine, for instance, used her position within the royal court to influence the French monarchy's decisions, while nuns sometimes used their knowledge of monastic politics to shift the balance of power within the abbey. Historians still debate how much of this was strategic manipulation versus genuine ambition. Was it about love, power, or simply survival? Interestingly, the punishments of medieval nuns also shed light on how religious institutions often saw women as both vessels of sanctity and potential threats to the order of things. Nuns who were perceived as stepping out of line weren't just seen as breaking vows. They were seen as a threat to the entire system of religious authority. As a result, they were often punished in ways that reflected the church's fear of the disruption their rebellion could cause. Yet, as we continue to learn, rebellion isn't always about a desire for destruction. It can also be a powerful force for change. Nuns, like many women throughout history, had to find ways to assert their autonomy, even in the most restricted environments. As we look back at these nuns, their stories are ones of compromise, resilience, and sometimes defiance. Women who used the only power they had to shape their world, even when it meant stepping outside the boundaries of what society deemed acceptable. Their scandalous acts, whether seen as an expression of their personal desires or as a reaction to an oppressive system, remind us of the complex relationship between faith, power, and the pursuit of autonomy. Now, as we continue to peel back the layers of these scandalous lives, let's look at some of the more bizarre and outrageous behaviors that some nuns were known for. In medieval times, convents were supposed to be sanctuaries, peaceful places where women could devote their lives to God. But in reality, some of these religious havens were anything but serene. Sure, there was prayer and service, but there was also luxury, drama, and excessive indulgence hidden behind the walls. And one of the most scandalous elements of this world was the fashion. Yes, fashion? You probably wouldn't associate nuns with luxury and high fashion, but there were moments when nuns became fashion icons in their own right, at least within the confines of their abbeys. Let's take a look at the elaborate robes and rich garments some nuns wore in certain convents. In many cases, the vow of poverty didn't quite translate into the austerity you might imagine. Nuns from wealthy families often had access to expensive fabrics, fine silks, and jewels. Some convents, especially those with noble connections, became luxurious enclaves where nuns lived like aristocrats, adorning themselves with intricate garments and fine accessories. The idea was that the convent was still a holy place, but the women who lived there could express their status through decorative clothing. Can you picture a nun sitting in a quiet chapel, wearing a finely embroidered gown while kneeling in prayer. Yeah, it's hard to imagine that kind of opulence in a place meant to be a sanctuary from material desires, right? But let's not get too caught up in the idea of luxury. There were also more mundane transgressions that might surprise you. For example, some nuns secretly engaged in gambling. Yes, gambling. In the middle of what was supposed to be a sacred life, some women found themselves betting away their money, even playing games of chance with fellow nuns and even outsiders. Historians still argue whether this was just a way to pass time or if it was indicative of a deeper issue, a desire for rebellion or escape from the rigorous and often oppressive structure of convent life. Whatever the case, the fact that gambling took place within convent walls is one of those stories that definitely challenges our perception of these religious institutions. On top of gambling, let's not forget about the lavish feasts. It's a little-known fact that some nuns, especially those in wealthier abbeys, hosted lavish banquets. These feasts were not just about the food, though that alone would make them worthy of mention. They were often events of great social importance. Wealthy nuns would invite noble guests, and sometimes even royalty, to dine in the abbey. Fine wines, roasted meats, and exotic fruits were served. And this was no ordinary dinner party. It was an event that reflected the power dynamics of the time, as these nuns, by virtue of their wealth, could entertain the rich and powerful. You may be wondering, did they pray between courses? Well, it's hard to say how much praying went on in between bites of roast lamb and spiced wine, but we do know that these gatherings were socially significant in more ways than one. And speaking of power, let's talk about how these nuns interacted with the political world outside their abbeys. Some nuns, especially those in high-status convents, were able to establish powerful political alliances through their relationships with kings, lords, and even popes. This wasn't just about gaining wealth. It was about shaping policy and influencing events. It's no surprise that medieval politics, like many other systems, was full of secret deals and backroom negotiations. Some nuns took full advantage of these connections, using their position to advance their personal or political goals. Historians still argue whether these alliances were purely about power, or if there was also an element of personal ambition and affection involved. This is where we see another layer of the scandalous nature of their lives. Nuns who were playing the political game just as well as any king or queen. Some nuns even engaged in openly defying the church's hierarchy to advance their goals. Take, for instance, the case of Abbess Eleanor of Aquitaine. While she may not have been a nun in the traditional sense, Eleanor's life was deeply tied to religious politics. As a member of the royal family, she was heavily involved in the political intrigues of both France and England. Her influence over religious figures who could have very well been nuns was part of her political power. Historians still debate the extent to which religion and politics merged for these women. Were they simply following their faith, or were they really engaged in a much bigger political game? And then there's the relationship between nuns and the church itself. The church, as we know, wasn't just a religious institution. It was a major political force. Nuns, with their land holdings, political alliances, and connections to the powerful elite, were often seen as pawns in this larger chess game. Yet, some women took advantage of the system to gain incredible political leverage. Historians still argue whether these women were oppressed victims or masters of manipulation. In a world where power was the ultimate goal, were these nuns just caught in a system of power, or were they actively shaping it to serve their own personal ambitions? As we move deeper into the lives of these medieval nuns, let's explore the real power they held behind their veils, the ability to shape the future of Christianity, and even influence the course of medieval politics. Despite being cloistered away in convents, many nuns played a significant role in the broader political and religious landscape of Europe. While the world may have viewed them as humble servants of God, in reality, some nuns wielded influence that was as important, if not more so, than the actions of kings and queens. How did they manage this, you ask? Well, it wasn't all through love affairs or luxurious living, though those certainly helped in some cases. Instead, many nuns used their intellectual power, spiritual authority, and political alliances to carve out their place in the medieval world. For instance, Hildegard of Bingen, who we've already mentioned, was not just an abbess. She was also an influential theologian and advisor to the Holy Roman Emperor. Hildegard had a profound impact on medieval Christianity through her writings, prophecies, and teachings. She didn't just stay within the confines of her convent. She used her influence to spread her ideas about spirituality and the role of women in the church. In fact, Hildegard's visions were so important that she was consulted by emperors and popes alike. Historians still argue whether her influence was purely spiritual or if it was strategic manipulation on her part. Some suggest that she used her religious standing as a means to manipulate political decisions in her favor, pushing her own agenda while maintaining an image of devout piety. The question remains, was she the true power behind her abbey's success, or was she merely a pawn in the larger political game of medieval Europe? But Hildegard wasn't the only one. Throughout medieval Europe, there were powerful abbesses who held real authority over vast land holdings. These women often controlled more land than the noble lords around them, and many nuns were entrusted with managing estates that produced goods, rents, and taxes. Some even had military control over the territories they governed, especially if their abbey was near conflict zones. Think about that for a moment. Nuns who commanded armies. These women weren't just worried about crops and prayers. They were concerned with defending their lands from invaders and making sure their abbey remained intact. One could argue that their ability to manage such power was almost political in nature, and often it was clear that they understood the stakes far beyond the walls of their convents. Historians still argue whether these women truly exercised power out of a sense of spiritual duty, or whether they used their positions to advance their own agendas. Some would say that the church in the medieval period was so intertwined with political power that every action, every decision was influenced by the desire to maintain that power. Women like Catherine of Siena, although not a nun in the traditional sense, were able to play the political game from within the church, influencing major decisions about papal policy and even the very direction of the Catholic Church. Could these nuns, who were technically supposed to be disengaged from the world, have used their positions to shape European politics? Perhaps let's move from the idea of political manipulation and examine how some nuns used their positions to influence intellectual thought during the Middle Ages. Much like Hildegard, other nuns were deeply involved in the intellectual currents of their time, using their cloistered environment as a sanctuary for learning and creation. Abbess Gertrude of Helfta was another nun who lived during the 13th century and became known for her spiritual writings, some of which challenged conventional thinking about God's nature and humanity's place in the divine order. She was part of a larger group of intellectual nuns who used their convents as places of study, where they would spend hours writing, reading, and discussing theological matters. While the church might not have always approved of their innovative ideas, these women managed to quietly contribute to Christian thought and philosophy, even as they adhered to the strictures of religious life. There's also the fascinating case of Saint Scholastica, the twin sister of Saint Benedict, who is often credited with founding the Benedictine nuns. Scholastica's life was filled with mysticism and intellectual pursuit, and although she lived in relative seclusion, her work had a lasting impact on the development of monastic communities. Her writings and her ability to lead the women who followed her demonstrated a quiet intellectual strength that belied the idea that women in medieval times were simply passive figures in religious life. Historians still debate the influence of female thinkers like Scholastica. Were they truly breaking new ground in Christian theology? Or were they simply upholding the doctrines of the time in a way that seemed fresh and innovative? there's also the reality that these women faced considerable challenges in a world dominated by male authority. The church, after all, wasn't exactly progressive when it came to female leadership. But despite this, nuns found ways to subvert the system, to use their spiritual authority and intellectual capacity to carve out space for themselves in the historical narrative. These women didn't have titles like queen or empress, but they certainly shaped the course of medieval history through their intellectual and political endeavors. As we continue to explore the scandalous lives of nuns, one thing becomes clear. These women were anything but passive participants in a world defined by men, whether through political intrigue, intellectual pursuits, or outright rebellion against the church's teachings. Medieval nuns found ways to create lives full of purpose and influence. They navigated a world that was sometimes cruel, often restrictive, and, at times, dangerously full of temptations. Yet, in their pursuit of power, love, and intellectual discovery, they proved that even those cloistered behind convent walls could leave a lasting impact on history. As we continue our exploration of medieval nuns, let's delve into the fascinating, and sometimes shocking, ways nuns bent the rules of their vows. The medieval world was one of strict codes of conduct, especially for women who chose a religious life. Nuns took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, promising to live a life removed from worldly pleasures. But as we've seen, human nature doesn't always follow rules, and many nuns found clever ways to avoid the strictures they were expected to follow, while still maintaining their status as holy figures. After all, what's the point of being the only woman in town with no rights if you can't sneak in a little fun here and there? Right. Let's start with the vow of chastity, which might seem like the most obvious promise to break. We've already mentioned illicit love affairs, but what about the more subtle ways that nuns pushed the boundaries? Some nuns found ways to form intimate relationships within the confines of convent life, often with the approval or complicity of their fellow nuns. In some abbeys, women developed deep emotional bonds, which historians still wonder about. Were these relationships purely platonic, or did they go deeper? The church, of course, would have insisted that these bonds were innocent. But let's be real. Some of these innocent connections were likely a little more than just spiritual sisterhood. Some nuns, historians claim, may have even engaged in secret relationships with priests or other men of the church, while still publicly maintaining their vow of chastity. In the case of Isabella of France, Queen and Mother of Kings, there were rumors of affairs with monks that defied the sanctity of her role as a queen. And some nuns were equally as bold in their flirtations or romantic entanglements with men of the church, the very people who were supposed to guide them in the ways of abstinence. Historians still debate whether these liaisons were spiritual exercises or actual romantic dalliances. After all, if you spent your life behind convent walls, you might find yourself looking for companionship in places that weren't exactly holy. And then there's the vow of obedience, which was equally hard to keep for many nuns. The abbot or abbess was expected to have complete control over the convent, but many nuns did not take kindly to dictatorial leadership. In some convents, nuns secretly challenged their superiors, taking matters into their own hands and resisting orders when it didn't suit their desires. Power struggles between abbesses and nuns weren't uncommon, and the stories of rebellious nuns often ended in shocking ways. In one case, nuns who felt they were being mistreated by an abbess outright overthrew her, replacing her with someone they thought would be more lenient. These weren't just small acts of defiance. They were full-on power plays, meant to establish control over their own lives. It was as though these nuns were saying, if we're going to live by your rules, we'll do it on our terms. But perhaps the most surprising of these rule-bending actions were related to the vow of poverty. While nuns were expected to live in austerity, many convents were some of the wealthiest institutions in medieval Europe. Nuns often controlled enormous estates. With large amounts of land and valuable resources, some convents were so wealthy that their nuns could afford luxuries like gold-embroidered robes, fancy meals, and ornate jewelry which, as you can imagine, didn't quite match the vow of poverty they had taken. The hypocrisy of it all must have been hard to ignore. Historians still argue whether these nuns were simply keeping the wealth to ensure the abbey's survival, or if they were indulging in luxury simply because they could. Some nuns even amassed personal wealth, in defiance of the very rules they were sworn to follow. One particularly eye-opening example is the nuns of the Abbey of Saint Denis in France, who were known for their opulent lifestyles. They had access to fine silk, rich food, and even luxurious furniture, which would have been unheard of for most people living in the medieval period. The church, of course, was aware of these indulgences, but because the abbey was so powerful, the wealthy nuns of Saint Denis got away with their behavior. The church didn't challenge their opulence because they understood that the wealth of the abbey was a necessary political tool. Historians still debate whether this kind of luxury was seen as a necessary indulgence to maintain the power and influence of the church, or if it was simply corruption hiding behind the guise of religion. In fact, many nuns with noble backgrounds were able to maintain wealth through their connections to their families. Some of these wealthy nuns used their familial wealth to fund religious projects, but others used it for their own personal gain, using abbey resources to fund their pet projects, and sometimes even to build personal empires within the abbey walls. One particularly extravagant nun even reportedly commissioned a personal chapel adorned with gold statues and rare gemstones, a clear contradiction to the humble lifestyle she was supposed to live. So, what can we learn from all this rule-breaking? Well, it turns out that even behind the holy walls of the convent, medieval nuns were just as human as the rest of us. They had their own desires, their own power struggles, and their own complicated relationships with authority. Some followed the rules, while others used the convent as a place to exercise their autonomy and control. Whether they were challenging the vow of chastity or enjoying the perks of wealth and power, these nuns were a lot more than just quiet figures in religious life. They were complicated, ambitious, and sometimes rebellious, exactly like the powerful women of any time. Now, as we continue to unravel the lives of medieval nuns, let's take a look at the extreme measures some nuns took when their hidden relationships or secretive actions came to light. The scandals that rippled through convents didn't just end with whispered gossip sometimes. They led to dramatic confrontations and public outcry. What happened when the secrets were exposed and the nuns' lives fell apart? Well, let's just say that some of these women had to face consequences so severe that they were hardly a far cry from the tales of royal betrayals and courtroom dramas we hear about in other parts of history. One infamous story involves nuns of the convent of St. Mary Magdalene in the 15th century. These nuns had secretly formed illicit relationships with noblemen, and when the scandal broke thanks to some disgruntled servants, their entire community was thrown into chaos. The convent, once a peaceful retreat for religious devotion, turned into a place where accusations flew, and the women found themselves excommunicated or forced into public penance. In one particularly dramatic moment, several of the nuns were marched in front of the local community, wearing hair shirts as a symbol of their repentance, while the whole town watched. This wasn't just about breaking vows. It was about public humiliation and the complete shattering of their reputation. In some cases, nuns were even banished from the abbey entirely, with some of them never to return to religious life. Their public disgrace became the stuff of legend. In some convents, the church's intervention was far less sympathetic. Medieval nuns were often seen as pawns in the larger political and religious game. Once their transgressions became too public, the church often took drastic steps to restore order. Some nuns who were caught in illicit affairs or in the act of rebellion were forced to leave the convent altogether, especially if they were seen as too much of a threat to the church's authority. This wasn't always a punishment. They were often given safe passage out of the abbey and sent to live on the margins of society. Others were imprisoned in small, isolated cells as punishment for their disobedience. Historians still debate whether this was the church's way of keeping the power balance in check, or if it was simply a tactic to avoid further scandal. Regardless, These extreme measures made clear one thing: even the most powerful nuns had to answer for their actions when they strayed too far. Perhaps one of the most shocking cases of exile and disgrace comes from the story of the Nun of Kent, a woman who in the 16th century claimed to have had a mystical experience involving a divine vision. She began publicly preaching her visions and was even believed to have gained a following within her convent. Initially, her visions were accepted by many, but as her teachings began to contradict official church doctrine, she was eventually summoned for trial. The church authorities accused her of heresy, not just because of her unconventional views, but because of the power she was gaining over the nuns in her convent. After being found guilty, she was imprisoned and forced to recant her beliefs in front of the entire religious community. This was a reminder to everyone: nuns might have power, but in the eyes of the church, their spiritual authority was only valid when it aligned with church doctrine. Historians still argue whether the Nun of Kent was an innocent woman caught in a political power struggle, or whether she was truly an unstable religious figure. But there were other nuns who faced far harsher fates, and their stories remain largely unwritten, silent, except for the few scattered records. Some of these women were executed for their involvement in affairs or disobedience to church orders. The nature of medieval society, with its emphasis on obedience and purity, meant that once a nun was deemed to have lost her reputation, there was little hope for redemption. Some nuns were accused of witchcraft, often just because they were too powerful or too independent. The connection between witchcraft accusations and women in positions of religious or social influence is well documented in medieval records, and some nuns were tragically caught up in these witch hunts, charged with summoning demons or disobeying the moral laws of God. When faced with such devastating consequences, some nuns chose to rebel outright, using their voices to challenge the church and its institutions. They didn't accept their punishment quietly. Instead, they used it as an opportunity to speak out against the strictures they had been forced to live under. One famous case involved the nun Margaret of Anjou, who not only had a complicated and scandalous affair, but challenged the church's power when she was accused of breaking her vows. Rather than submit quietly to her fate, she publicly denounced her accusers, arguing that she had been victimized by a system that gave women no power. In the end, Margaret was exiled and forced to live in isolation. But her outspoken defiance inspired many other women who lived under the same oppressive conditions. What these stories reveal is that even behind the closed doors of the abbey, medieval nuns were engaged in struggles for power, identity, and autonomy. Their lives were not as simple as living out the vows they took. These women were often fighting battles that transcended their vows, battles that involved the very institutions that were supposed to guide them toward salvation. They were not just passive recipients of religious authority. They were women whose desires and ambitions shaped the course of history, even if that history was largely hidden behind convent walls. As we delve deeper into the world of medieval nuns, let's explore some of the weird and wonderful practices that made their way into convents, further revealing the complex and sometimes bizarre lives these women led. You might think that nuns spent their days in prayer and meditation, but you'd be surprised to learn that convents were often hotbeds of creativity, rebellion, and intrigue. While the outside world was consumed by wars, plague, and the sweeping changes of medieval life, these women were involved in all sorts of odd and fascinating activities that, to this day, continue to intrigue historians. One of the more curious aspects of convent life was the practice of spiritual healing. Now, before you start imagining nuns waving incense around like mystical sorceresses, let's clarify. Some nuns were genuinely skilled in the art of healing. But these weren't just any ordinary remedies. These were folk remedies, passed down through generations. Many nuns were responsible for herbal medicine, creating potions, salves, and tinctures from plants found in convent gardens. They would use these to treat everything from minor ailments to more serious diseases. The real twist here, some of these remedies bordered on the mystical. While many of the treatments were based on scientific principles, at least for the time, the idea of spiritual healing was often intertwined with the practice. Nuns would perform their healing rituals while praying for divine intervention, mixing faith and medicine in a way that seems almost magical by today's standards. Historians still debate whether these healing practices were seen as heretical by the church, or if they were simply part of popular culture that the church allowed to persist. Some scholars argue that the church was deeply suspicious of any form of non-sanctioned medicine, and that nuns who practiced these forms of healing were risking excommunication. But others contend that the church saw the value in these women's abilities, especially as medieval medicine was often more about ritual and prayer than actual medical knowledge. So, were these nuns healers? Or were they witches in disguise? It's still a question worth pondering. Another quirky aspect of convent life involved the strange and unexpected role of nuns in art and culture. While we often think of nuns as the embodiment of piety and serenity, many of them were actually highly involved in the creation of art, literature, and musical compositions. Some convents became famous for their illuminated manuscripts, where nuns painstakingly created religious texts, often decorating them with elaborate paintings and calligraphy. These manuscripts weren't just religious texts, they were pieces of art in their own right, showcasing the artistic talents of women who had little exposure to the world beyond the abbey walls. Historians still argue whether this kind of artistic production was merely a form of devotion, or if it allowed nuns to express their own creative voices. Were these women truly submitting to the church's orders, or were they using the manuscript process as a way to engage in personal expression? The answer is likely somewhere in between. These artworks often depicted religious-themed saints, angels, the Virgin Mary, but they also incorporated intricate patterns, flourishes, and floral designs that had nothing to do with religious doctrine. Some of these designs were so intricate and beautiful that they stood out as distinct forms of personal art, a quiet rebellion against the dreariness of convent life. And then there's the strange phenomenon of nun-made musical compositions. Some nuns were remarkably talented musicians and composers, creating some of the most beautiful liturgical music of their time. Take Hildegard of Bingen, again, who not only wrote music, but also created her own musical system that was highly regarded by the church. Her compositions weren't just about sound, they were also about spirituality and divine inspiration. These nuns weren't just pious, they were creative geniuses in their own right, producing works that would go on to influence church music for generations. For these women, composing music was not just a religious act. It was a way to channel their inner desires, to express themselves in a world that often suppressed their individuality. But let's not forget the wilder side of convent life. Some nuns, especially in larger convents, were known to participate in secret rituals, which blurred the lines between religion and folk traditions. These rituals often involved dancing, chanting, and sometimes even mysterious rites that were seen as less than holy by the church. There are rumors that in some convents, nuns would secretly engage in pagan-inspired ceremonies, celebrating the seasons, the moon, and even fertility rites rituals that weren't exactly in line with Christian teachings. The idea of nuns engaging in secret pagan practices is a popular one, but again, historians still argue whether these were widespread or just isolated incidents. One thing's for sure, where there's a lack of freedom, creativity and rebellion find a way to seep through the cracks. As we move through the history of these nuns, what stands out is their resourcefulness. They weren't just sitting in their cells, praying all day. Well, not always. Some nuns used their position in the convent as a launching pad for creativity, rebellion, and even political maneuvering. Whether it was through art, music, or secret rituals, these women were not as passive as history often portrays them. They were ambitious, creative, and, at times, even subversive, using their position within the convent to challenge the rules and assert their autonomy. Historians often like to paint nuns as docile, obedient figures, but these stories of secret practices, artistic expression, and bold political moves tell a different tale. The medieval nun was not a passive figure hidden away in a silent convent. She was a woman with ambition, creative energy, and a desire for power. And sometimes she found a way to express that in the most unexpected places. As we continue uncovering the more hidden aspects of convent life, let's take a moment to explore the mysterious deaths of some nuns throughout medieval history. While we think of monasteries and convents as places of calm, piety, and refuge, there were times when the quiet of these spaces was shattered by mysterious events. Some nuns, whose lives seemed perfectly devout on the outside, met untimely and often suspicious ends. These deaths often raised eyebrows, and centuries later, some still remain shrouded in mystery, giving rise to theories and whispers that hint at darker secrets lurking behind the abbey walls. One particularly bizarre example comes from the convent of the Holy Cross in the 14th century, where a young nun was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Her body was discovered in the convent garden, but there were no clear signs of what had happened to her. Some say she had fallen from the rooftop of the abbey, while others believe that she was poisoned by someone within the convent. The gossip in the nearby village was quick to circulate whispers of a love affair gone wrong, a noble suitor, and perhaps a jealous fellow nun. Historians still argue whether this was a tragic accident or the result of a murderous plot. Was this a case of unrequited love or personal conflict? The truth remains unclear, but it's a reminder that even within the walls of the convent, there were plenty of drama and intrigue. Another mysterious case involves Abbess Agnes of Le Mans, who was found dead in the early 12th century, under equally suspicious circumstances. Unlike many abbesses who had substantial power, Agnes was said to have been a reformer, trying to bring stricter discipline and structure to her convent. But this move wasn't universally popular. Some nuns in the abbey, especially those who had enjoyed a more indulgent lifestyle, saw her reforms as an attack on their way of life. A few months after these changes began, Abbess Agnes was discovered dead in her bed, with no signs of illness. The official story was that she died of natural causes, but rumors of foul play persisted. Historians still debate whether Agnes's death was a case of poisoning, a plot by disgruntled nuns, or if it was simply the consequence of her tough leadership style. The fact that the abbey never conducted an investigation into her death only fueled the suspicion that something much darker had happened. The fact that convents and abbeys were often isolated places also contributed to the mysteries surrounding some nuns' deaths. It wasn't uncommon for deaths to be covered up by those who didn't want a scandal to tarnish their reputation or disrupt the orderly life of the convent. In some cases, high-ranking nuns would be buried hastily and their bodies quickly removed from view, leaving behind little trace of their passing. Historians have uncovered several examples of convents where leaders disappeared mysteriously, with little explanation provided. When powerful women fall, especially within an institution like the church, things can get covered up quickly. But death in the convent wasn't always due to malice or suspicion. Some of these women died from plague or disease, which often spread quickly through the tightly knit communities of nuns. For many nuns, death was simply a part of the harsh reality of living in a time where medicine was rudimentary at best. And yet, it's remarkable how some convents treated the passing of nuns. For instance, some nuns who had committed grave sins were sometimes buried in unmarked graves. Others, however, were given grand funerals and massive memorials, depending on their family connections or the power they held within the religious community. The memorialization of nuns after death often became a political act, with abbesses and other powerful nuns making sure that their legacies were protected. But let's not forget that some deaths were viewed as divine. Certain mysterious deaths of nuns were sometimes seen as signs of divine favor, or even martyrdom. There were cases of nuns who were believed to have died in ecstasy, their deaths attributed to visions of God or divine spiritual experiences. These stories were sometimes used as a way to cement a nun's legacy, as if her death marked her as especially holy. Canonization, or sainthood, was a long and complex process, but many nuns were posthumously declared saints because their mysterious deaths were considered to be miraculous. These accounts added to the lore of the convent, creating myths that would be told for generations. Of course, some nuns' deaths were much less romanticized. In some cases, the harshness of medieval life combined with the rigorous religious expectations placed upon women in convents led to sickness, exhaustion, and mental strain. There's even evidence that some nuns died from self-imposed starvation as a way of protesting the oppressive system they lived under. The psychological and emotional toll of living in such a tightly controlled environment was considerable, and the notion of a spiritual martyrdom through self-inflicted suffering became a part of the religious narrative for some women. As we look back at these mysterious deaths, one thing is clear. Even in the most sacred of spaces, the lives of medieval nuns were often marked by the same struggles, secrets, and power plays that defined the outside world. Whether their deaths were caused by political intrigue, personal conflict, or spiritual visions, these women's lives and legacies were as complex and unpredictable as the world they lived in. Now that we've looked at some of the more dramatic ends to these scandalous lives, let's take a turn and explore some of the more unconventional nuns. Those who defied the norms of their time in ways that were blatantly rebellious. While many nuns were expected to lead lives of obedience and piety, others found ways to carve out autonomy, or even to question the very rules they had sworn to uphold. Some were pioneers of sorts, creating lives that were full of contradictions, and in doing so, they gave us some of the most colorful stories from medieval convents. Take the case of Margaret of Scotland, who was a queen and a nun, but not in the way you'd expect. Margaret wasn't just a royal in her own right. She had a deep spiritual connection, and later became a part of the noble women's religious orders. While most queens would have been expected to focus on political marriages and maintaining the throne, Margaret's interest in religion led her to take part in the spiritual community of women. Historians have debated whether Margaret ever fully embraced the vow of chastity, or if her later years were spent in a more politically calculated religious life, using her position to influence both her kingdom and the church. Did she truly care about her vows, or was she simply using religion to solidify her political power? This is one of the key questions that remains unresolved in the historical record. Was Margaret truly one of those nuns who embodied piety, or did she use her religious life to maintain control? Then, there were the nuns who challenged the very fabric of the convent's authority. Many convents were set up with the idea that women would live a life of obedience and humility. However, some nuns had very different ideas. One particularly rebellious figure was Abbess Agnes of the Abbey of St. Cecilia in the 13th century. Agnes was known for her uncompromising nature, which sometimes clashed with the ideals of the church. As abbess, she was known to revolt against the hierarchical structure of the convent, which was unusual for her time. Some historians claim that she created a tension within her abbey by refusing to conform to the more rigid aspects of monastic life. It was said that Agnes rejected the traditional roles of women and often used her power to influence political matters in favor of the convent's interests. Could this have been a case of spiritual rebellion? Or was Agnes simply a woman fed up with being subjugated by a system that didn't seem to value her personal agency? But it wasn't just abbesses who were challenging the status quo. Nunneries in France, especially during the 16th century, saw a rise in women who openly questioned their vows of chastity, creating a dissonance between their public image as pious servants of God and their private lives. Some nuns were known to have open affairs, with some of the most outrageous tales involving nuns who formed romantic relationships with members of the local clergy. For many of these nuns, the promises of chastity and silence didn't quite match the reality of desire. The church tried to crack down on these illicit relationships, but the temptation of forbidden love often led to passionate liaisons behind the walls of the convent. Some of these nuns were secretly married to the men they loved, even though they had vowed to remain celibate. Historians still argue whether these unions were spontaneous acts of rebellion, or if the women simply sought solace from a life that denied them personal fulfillment. Regardless, these acts of defiance opened up a window into the personal struggles that nuns faced within the strict confines of religious life. Not all rebellious nuns engaged in romantic affairs or political machinations. Some sought out rebellion in ways that were intellectual. These women used their status as nuns to become scholars, philosophers, and writers in a world that often relegated women to the role of passive followers. One particularly interesting example is Sister Catherine of Siena, who, despite living in an abbey, wrote an extensive collection of writings on theology, often openly defying the accepted doctrines of her time. Her work critiqued not only the political leaders of her era, but also questioned church dogma. Historians still debate whether Catherine was a true theological pioneer, or simply a woman who found her voice in a world that tried to stifle it. Regardless, her writings became a source of inspiration for many later feminist scholars, and she is seen as a precursor to the kind of intellectual resistance that would rise much later in history. Of course, it wasn't all about intellectual rebellion or breaking vows. Sometimes nuns simply found themselves challenging authority by creating unique cultural spaces within their convents. The convent of St. Clare, for example, became a hothouse of creativity, where women were free to develop their own artistic practices, creating religious artworks that would later influence the broader European art scene. These nuns weren't just passive recipients of religious orders. They were creative forces who used their art as a means of expressing their individuality, whether it was in their paintings, their sculptures, or their liturgical music. These nuns used their convents as space to express ideas, even though their creativity was supposed to be focused on religious devotion. The interesting thing about these artistic rebellions is that they didn't often collide with the church's expectations. They simply existed within the boundaries that the church had set, pushing the limits of what was acceptable while remaining within the sacred context of their vows. By the time these nuns and their rebellious acts were discovered, many had already influenced church culture, both by their intellectual resistance and their arts. Their stories are much more than just scandals. They represent the desire for agency, for women to make their mark on the world, despite the restrictive norms that tried to keep them in line. The lives of these nuns prove that even in the most constricted of environments, there is room for self-expression, subversive thought, and individual rebellion. They were not just figures of obedience. They were women fighting for freedom and claiming their voices in a world that often demanded their silence. Now, let's take a moment to explore some of the more whimsical and bizarre stories that have emerged from the lives of medieval nuns. Tales that reveal the human side of these women and give us a glimpse into the personal struggles and delightful absurdities that made their lives anything but ordinary. You might think of nuns as primarily pious and devout, their lives shaped by religious duty. But as we've seen, there was much more going on behind the convent walls than what the church would have liked you to believe. And just as in every other corner of human history, where there is power, there are always those who find a way to be creatively mischievous. One such story is that of the nun who turned the convent into a secret pub. In medieval Italy, there was a tale of a nun who secretly ran a tavern in the convent's cellar, serving wine to visitors and other nuns after hours. She was a bit of a legend among the locals, who would sneak into the convent under the cover of night for a drink or two. The abbess, of course, had no idea, and the nun managed to keep the tavern under wraps for years, all while maintaining her appearance of piety and devotion. The only thing that betrayed her secret was the occasional drunken giggle coming from the convent's otherwise solemn halls. Historians debate whether this was a sign of rebellion against the rigid religious life, or if it was just a fun little escape for women trapped in a world of duty and silence. The idea of a nun running a pub seems absurd, but it's a delightful reminder that nuns were women first and foremost, with desires and yearnings that weren't always aligned with their vows. Then, there's the tale of the nun who was a champion fencer. This particular story comes from medieval England, where one convent had a rather unusual nun who was known for her exceptional sword-fighting skills. According to local legend, she had been trained in the art of fencing by her father, a knight, before she entered the convent. But once she was there, she wasn't content to let those skills go to waste. No, this nun became the convent's undefeated champion, challenging other women in the area to friendly bouts. She would often practice late into the night in the convent courtyard, wielding a sword with grace and precision. The nuns, most of whom had never held a sword, were often both amazed and a little bewildered by her skill. Historians still argue whether this nun's fencing was just a way for her to pass the time, or if it was her way of asserting control over her environment, a way of having agency in a world that often sought to control every aspect of her existence. Perhaps the oddest story comes from the nun who took over the church's choir. While convents were often places of prayer, contemplation, and silence, some nuns found their voice in unexpected ways. This particular nun, a gifted singer, took it upon herself to revamp the convent's musical practices. Under her leadership, the convent's choir went from mediocre to remarkably good, performing extravagant compositions and gaining the attention of the local nobility. But it wasn't just about the music. This nun's leadership caused quite a stir, especially because the more conservative nuns didn't appreciate her mixing the sacred with the secular. She wasn't just leading hymns. She was bringing in instruments and new musical styles that many saw as too worldly. Historians still argue whether this was a sign of creative expression or an attempt to push boundaries. Some even suggest that she used the choir as a means of gaining power within the convent, subtly asserting her authority over the other women. In many cases, nuns in medieval Europe were not as secluded as we might imagine. While convents were indeed meant to be places of retreat from the world, there was often a lot of movement and interaction with the outside world, sometimes in unexpected ways. One particularly interesting example comes from the nuns of the Abbey of St. Peter in Germany, who were rumored to have engaged in underground trade. These nuns were known to make and sell goods, such as woolen garments, meats, and even brews. And while this was a common practice among many convents, these particular nuns were said to have had connections with merchants and noble families outside the abbey. The odd part, they were said to have conducted some of their trade in the dead of night, making secret deals while the abbey slept. Historians debate whether this was simply shrewd business, or whether it was an act of rebellion, a way for these women to assert control over their own destinies and escape the constant scrutiny of the church. Then, there was the nun who became a master brewer. In medieval France, there was a convent that became famous for producing some of the best beer in the region. The nun in charge of the brewing process was said to have learned the craft from local brewers before entering the convent, and she quickly became so skilled at it that she eventually taught the other nuns how to brew, turning the convent into a miniature brewery. The beer they produced wasn't just a source of income for the abbey, it was also believed to have medicinal properties. The story of this nun's success is one of humor, but it also speaks to the ways in which convents often adapted to their surroundings, finding creative solutions to sustain their communities. As we reflect on these stories of rebellious nuns, it's clear that they weren't as confined as we might assume. Behind the walls of medieval convents, women found ways to live complex, multifaceted lives. They may have been bound by vows, but they were not without their personal freedom, and they often exercised that freedom in ways that were uniquely their own, whether through art, music, business, or, yes, even a little secret brewing or fencing. What these women remind us of is the incredible resilience and resourcefulness of those who lived under such restrictive conditions. They were able to find ways to assert their identity and express themselves, even if it meant breaking a few rules along the way. Historians still debate how much of this was truly rebellious, and how much was simply about survival. But one thing is certain, these women were more than just figures of obedience. They were complex, creative, and often subversive, making their stories some of the most fascinating and enduring in medieval history. As As we near the end of our journey into the scandalous lives of medieval nuns, let's take a moment to reflect on the legacy of these women and how their stories have shaped the way we view women's roles in religious life. While many of these women have remained hidden in the pages of history, their stories offer valuable insights into the struggles for autonomy, power, and identity that transcended the medieval period. These nuns were not just pious women cloistered away in silent contemplation. They were rebels, creators, and political players, often finding creative ways to navigate the complex systems of church authority and societal expectations. For instance, consider the impact of powerful abbesses who, as we've seen, were often in charge of vast estates and monetary resources. Their ability to wield political power and influence local rulers was a significant, though often underappreciated, aspect of their role. Historians continue to debate the extent to which women like Abbess Hildegard of Bingen shaped the religious and political landscape of their time. Some believe these abbesses were pawns in the larger political games of the church, while others argue they were more like chess masters, manipulating the church's influence to secure both their own position and the future of their convents. Historians still argue whether their power was primarily spiritual or political, but what is certain is that these women played key roles in maintaining the economic stability of their institutions and protecting their nuns from external pressures. Let's not forget the mysterious nature of convents, which has sparked speculation about the kind of life that was really lived behind those stone walls. These spaces were supposed to be safe, holy, and apart from worldly concerns. Yet the scandals we've explored show that convents were far from the serene refuges they were imagined to be. The rumors of underground trade, forbidden relationships, and secret meetings suggest that these women, despite their vows, were very much involved in the complex social fabric of medieval life. The mysterious deaths, the secret identities, and even the innovative business practices of some convents indicate that these nuns were far more than just passive figures of religious submission. But what does this all mean for us today? Why should we care about the secretive, rebellious, and often scandalous lives of medieval nuns? Well, beyond their individual stories, these women remind us of the broader struggle for women's autonomy in a world dominated by male authority. In many ways, the convent was one of the few places where women could gain a sense of power. But it was also a space where oppression and control were woven into the very fabric of their lives. The way nuns navigated these spaces, whether through rebellion, creativity, or strategic alliances, speaks to the resilience and determination of women in a time when their choices were severely limited. Their stories offer a critical lens through which we can examine the tension between religion and individual freedom. For many, the convent was a refuge from the world. But for others, it was simply another form of entrapment, a place where the rules were imposed and the freedoms of life were sacrificed for the sake of religious duty. For centuries, these women were forced to live in the shadow of these vows, with very little control over their own destinies. Yet, many found ways to assert themselves, whether through the power of their voice, their art, or, at times, through rebellion. Interestingly, many of the powerful women of history, especially those in religious life, were undermined by male historians. These women's lives and contributions were often dismissed or overshadowed by the dominance of patriarchal narratives that favored male figures. However, as historians continue to revisit these women's stories, we see a shift in how they are viewed. We now understand that the stories of these nuns are not just about obedience and sacrifice, but also about autonomy, rebellion, and creativity. These nuns weren't just bound by their vows. They were complex individuals navigating a rigid system that attempted to silence them. In modern times, these stories of defiance and autonomy are inspiring to many who fight for women's rights and equality. The resilience of these women in the face of overwhelming social and religious expectations serves as a reminder of the power of women to overcome adversity, to find ways to express their identity, and to claim agency over their lives. Even in the most difficult of circumstances, these nuns, whether they were involved in political intrigue, art, or rebellion, serve as examples of strength, courage, and determination. As we reflect on these women's lives, it's clear that their stories deserve to be remembered not just as tales of scandal or rebellion, but as testaments to human spirit. These women lived complex, multifaceted lives, and through their stories, we can glimpse a different side of medieval history, one that challenges the conventional narratives and reminds us of the many hidden voices throughout history that have shaped the world in ways both large and small. Now, let's take a step back and look at the impact of the scandalous lives of medieval nuns on the evolution of religious orders and the modern understanding of the relationship between church and women. The stories we've explored, filled with rebellion, creativity, hidden relationships, and personal struggles, have shed light on how these women navigated a complex world and how their actions resonated far beyond the convent walls. While many of these nuns lived in a time when they were expected to be obedient and silent, their stories revealed just how influential they were in shaping the future of religious communities and women's roles within them. One major legacy of these women is the legacy of convent autonomy. As we've seen, many abbesses and nuns were in charge of significant resources, including land, money, and even military control over their territories. Despite their supposed subordination to the male-dominated church hierarchy, they held significant influence over the daily lives of the people in their care, and some were able to wield considerable power in both religious and secular matters. Over time, these women proved that the roles of women in religious life were not merely passive or relegated to the background, but rather that they could create dynamic spaces where their authority and vision shaped the religious experience of countless others. Historians often debate whether the medieval church really allowed these women to hold such power, or if their influence was, in fact, covert, shaped through subtle manipulation or unspoken forms of control. Historians still argue whether these women were primarily victims of the system, using their limited power to survive, or whether they were truly architects of their own destinies, using their religious positions to build subtle empires that would influence religious orders for centuries to come. This remains an ongoing debate in academic circles, and one that invites us to reconsider how we view the intersection of religion, power, and gender. The public image of nuns in medieval history has often been clouded by the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that were supposed to define their lives. These vows, when taken at face value, paint a picture of nuns as passive and devout figures who gave up their personal desires for the sake of religious duty. However, the scandals we've explored challenge this narrative and show us that medieval nuns were not simply docile. They were independent, ambitious, and often quite resourceful. Their stories remind us that the lives of women, whether cloistered in a convent or living in the wider world, are often full of contradictions, complexities, and hidden narratives that don't always fit neatly into the roles prescribed for them by society. The impact of these women's actions was also felt in the development of religious reform movements. Over time, many religious orders began to experience a shift in focus as male-dominated institutions started to take a more controlling role in convent life, especially as the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance. The Church, in its bid to assert more control over its female members, began to impose stricter rules that minimized the autonomy nuns had enjoyed in previous centuries. The rise of clerical reform in the 15th and 16th centuries sought to root out corruption and ensure obedience to church laws, which sometimes meant taking power away from female leaders in convents and reinforcing the patriarchal hierarchy. This led to a reduction in the authority of abbesses and female religious leaders, something that historians believe had long-term effects on the role of women in religious life. Yet, despite the tightening of church control, the stories of rebellious nuns, creative thinkers, and powerful abbesses did not disappear. Instead, they left a lasting legacy that helped shape the way women would eventually engage with religion in the modern world. Medieval nuns laid the groundwork for future generations of women who would continue to push for greater autonomy and intellectual freedom. Many modern feminist scholars point to these early medieval nuns as pioneers of women's empowerment, showing us that even in the most restricted environments, women can find ways to exert influence and create spaces for themselves. These nuns were also a crucial part of the historical narrative that would later lead to the feminist movements of the 18th century and beyond. By challenging the constraints placed on them, they helped open the door for future generations of women who would question societal norms, fight for equality, and work toward more inclusive forms of religious expression. Their stories remind us that change often begins quietly, within spaces where people are least expected to rebel. History shows us that these small, seemingly insignificant acts of rebellion, whether through the art of secret love affairs, the creation of underground breweries, or the defiance of authority, can eventually contribute to larger cultural shifts that change the course of history. As we wind down our exploration of the scandalous lives of medieval nuns, we are left with a profound sense of the complexity of these women's lives. While they were often boxed into roles defined by religious institutions, many nuns found ways to assert themselves within the confines of the system, whether through art, music, rebellion, or intellectual endeavors. These women made their mark on history, and though their stories might have been silenced by the weight of tradition, they continue to whisper through the centuries, reminding us of the ways in which women have always found ways to claim power, challenge norms, and shape the world. As we come to the final chapter of our journey through the scandalous lives of medieval nuns, let's take a moment to reflect on the lasting impact these women have had on history and the lessons we can draw from their experiences. These women, who lived lives of paradox and contradiction, continue to speak to us across the centuries, showing us that even in the most restrictive systems, individuality and agency can still find a way to thrive. Their stories are not just about rebellion and scandal, they are also about humanity, resilience, and the complex interplay of faith and freedom. When we consider the lives of these nuns, it's easy to be distracted by the drama, the intrigue, and the scandals. However, as we reflect on their legacies, we must also acknowledge the courage it took to live within such strict, controlled environments. These women, many of whom were born into a society that offered them few options for autonomy or self-expression, found ways to carve out spaces for themselves, whether through art, music, or acts of defiance. They showed that even in the most isolated corners of medieval society, women could still assert their will and influence the world around them. Take, for example, the lives of nuns like Hildegard of Bingen and Catherine of Siena, whose theological writings and spiritual insights continue to inspire feminist thinkers, theologians, and historians to this day. Their ability to blend the devotional life with intellectual pursuit set the stage for future generations of women who would go on to become influential leaders in both the church and the world. Through their efforts, they opened doors for women to explore the boundaries of faith, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the intellectual and spiritual rebellions that would eventually lead to the rise of modern feminism. However, not all the stories we've explored today have the same air of nobility or purposeful rebellion. The secretive relationships, the suspicious deaths, and the hidden indulgences reveal a side of convent life that is far more human. With all its imperfections and moral gray areas, these nuns were not saints in the conventional sense. They were, for better or worse, flawed, messy, and complex individuals. But isn't that part of the reason their stories resonate so deeply with us today? In a time when women were often seen as little more than tools for religious and political systems, these nuns found ways to forge their own paths, even if it meant breaking a few rules along the way. The medieval church saw itself as the ultimate authority in both the spiritual and the temporal realms. Yet, as we've seen, The lives of nuns revealed that even within the walls of religious institutions, there was always room for subversion, questioning, and personal ambition. Whether through the quiet resistance of a nun who defied the abbess, or the louder defiance of a woman who ran a secret tavern or formed a love affair, these women weren't just subjects of a patriarchal system. They were agents of change, whether they recognized it or not. Even today, their stories of resilience and resistance continue to have relevance. We live in a world where women continue to navigate complex social structures and often still face gendered expectations and limitations. The medieval nun's journey serves as a reminder that the fight for autonomy and self-expression is ongoing, and the lessons from these women's stories can still inform and inspire us in our own battles for equality and personal freedom. By examining these women's lives, we gain not just a glimpse into the past, but also a deeper understanding of the power dynamics that continue to shape our world. The church may have held a stranglehold on women's lives in the medieval era, but the nuns with their art, their scandals, and their rebellion showed us that no system is impenetrable, and even those confined to convents could have a profound influence on the world. These nuns weren't just part of the religious system. They shaped it, often without the world even realizing it. And so, we reach the end of our journey. But the stories of these nuns live on, reminding us that no matter how much we try to suppress the human spirit, individuality, and freedom, these forces will always find a way to rise up. The nuns of the medieval era lived lives full of complicated contradictions, pious and rebellious, obedient and defiant, and in doing so, they left us with timeless stories that challenge our views on religion, power, and the resilience of women. Now, as we come to the end of this tale, take a deep breath and think about these nuns, their struggles, their scandals, and their resilience. What would it have been like to live in their shoes, under the same pressure to be both devout and powerful? What do their stories have to teach us about resilience in the face of hardship? Rest easy, for the story of these nuns, both scandalous and inspirational, will continue to inspire the generations that come after them, and 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 that come after them.